In the static of a forgotten war, there was a broadcast, a thin, silver thread of a melody, a child's humming that cut through the noise of artillery and fear. The history books, if they mention it at all, call it the Nightingale's Song, a simple, patriotic program meant to bring comfort to a nation on its knees. That was the lie. The melody was not comfort. It was a key, a precisely calibrated acoustic signal designed to unlock something in the human mind. Those who listened too closely didn't just feel comforted, they began to change. Before we tune to that frequency, you must understand, this channel is not for the passive listener. We are broadcasting the truths that were silenced, the histories that were surgically removed from the record. If you're not prepared to question the very nature of the reality you inhabit, turn the dial now. But if you feel the pull of the secret song, the hum of the hidden truth, then subscribe. Prove you are one of the few who can hear the real message beneath the noise. What happened in that brutal winter of 1942 was not a desperate act of propaganda. It was the largest psychoacoustic experiment in human history, a state-sponsored program to weaponize sound, to see if a nation's soul could be retuned, one mind at a time, using nothing more than a simple, haunting lullaby. Imagine a city of ghosts, besieged, starving, and frozen. Their only connection to the outside world, their only source of hope, was the radio. Huddled in basements, clustered around crackling speakers, they would wait for it, the Nightingale. But they weren't listening to a song. They were being exposed to a weapon disguised as hope, delivered directly into the most vulnerable corners of their homes and their minds. The architects of this acoustic plague were not soldiers or spies. They were men of science and art, a union of the clinical and the sublime that created something monstrous. The mind behind it all was Dr. Ivan Volkov, a neurophysiologist whose name has been systematically scrubbed from every academic record. A gaunt, bloodless man with pale eyes that seemed to absorb light, Volkov saw the human mind not as a seat of consciousness, but as a flawed electrical instrument. The chaos of war, the fear, the dissent, he saw these not as emotional responses, but as a kind of signal noise, a societal arrhythmia that could be corrected. He believed he could cure the disease of individuality itself. But Volkov was no artist. He could map the brain, but he could not touch the soul. For that, he needed Anton Levin. Levin was the nation's most celebrated composer, a man whose symphonies were said to capture the very essence of the motherland. When the war began, his genius was co-opted. He was brought to a secret facility deep beneath the city's military command, a concrete bunker designated Project Nightingale. He was not asked to serve, he was ordered. His family, he was reminded, was safe only as long as his work was satisfactory. Levin, a man of profound sensitivity, with haunted eyes and hands that trembled when he wasn't at a piano, was tasked with writing the melody. He was to compose the lullaby that would carry Volkov's poison. The project was sold to the high command as the ultimate morale booster. Under the guise of the Aegis Initiative, Volkov was given unlimited resources. He seized control of the Grand National Radio Tower, a magnificent steel spire that was a symbol of the nation's voice. Its broadcast equipment was stripped out and replaced with something new. Technicians, sworn to secrecy under threat of treason, installed strange, humming oscillators and arrays of vacuum tubes that had no place in a normal radio station. Volkov's science was terrifyingly precise. He began by analyzing hundreds of folk lullabies, breaking them down not by melody, but by their bioacoustic properties, the specific frequencies that induce states of calm, trust, and suggestibility. He discovered a pattern, a subharmonic frequency, a low, pulsing hum almost below the threshold of human hearing that resonated directly with the brain's limbic system. This was his weapon, the carrier wave. Levin's task was to create a melody so hauntingly beautiful, so achingly sad and yet hopeful, that the conscious mind would cling to it. The melody was the delivery system, designed to distract the listener's higher functions, while Volkov's carrier wave bypassed their defenses and went to work directly on the primal brain. To make the weapon complete, they needed a voice. Not a trained opera singer, but the pure, untainted sound of innocence. They found her in a state orphanage. A 10-year-old girl named Katia, with a voice like clear water. She was told she was singing to give the soldiers courage. She never knew what she was truly being used for. The first hint of the song's true power was witnessed by Mikhail, the tower's chief radio engineer. A stolid, practical man, he was deeply suspicious of Volkov's modifications. He saw equipment that belonged in a laboratory, not a broadcast booth. One night, during a preliminary test, he was ordered to route a low-power signal to a speaker in an adjacent holding block, where a group of captured partisans were being held. Mikkel watched through a thick glass window. He saw the prisoners, defiant and angry, spitting at the guards. Then the broadcast began. The little girl's voice, fragile and pure, filled the room. The men fell silent. Their angry expressions softened, replaced by a strange, slack-jawed confusion. Then something else. The anger in their eyes didn't just fade, it was extinguished. They became docile, blank. One of them, a hardened man with a scarred face, began to hum along, a beatific, empty smile on his lips. His eyes, which moments before had burned with hatred, were now as placid and empty as a still pond. Mikkel felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This wasn't comfort. This wasn't morale. This was erasure. He had just witnessed the first successful test of the science of submission. The Nightingale's song became the city's nightly sacrament. As the sirens wailed their prelude, a collective, sacred silence would fall. In bombed-out apartments and crowded shelters, families huddled around glowing radio dials as if they were hearths. The little girl's voice, carried on Levin's heartbreaking melody, became the city's shared pulse. It was an anchor of beauty in an ocean of ugliness, a nightly ritual of hope. But a subtle and terrible change began to ripple through the populace, a quiet plague that only the most observant could see. It started with the soldiers on leave. Men who had returned from the front as shattered, rage-filled ghosts, haunted by what they had seen, began to change after a few weeks of listening to the nightly broadcast. A lieutenant who had been prone to violent nightmares and drunken tirades became unnervingly calm. His family at first called it a miracle, but the calm was a vacuum. He no longer spoke of his comrades. He no longer wept. He would sit for hours, polishing his rifle with a serene, blank focus, his eyes empty of memory. He was not healed. He was hollowed out. The transformation spread to the factories. A woman named Sophia, a fiery union organizer who had fought tirelessly for fairer rations, became a model of productivity. She stopped speaking at meetings. She stopped questioning authority. She simply worked, her movements efficient, her face a mask of placid compliance. The factory bosses praised her as a patriot. Her friends, who remembered her laughter and her anger, looked at her with a growing sense of dread. The fire in her had been extinguished, replaced by the cold efficiency of a machine. Anton Levin, the composer, was a prisoner in his own genius. He was housed in a gilded cage beneath the city, forced to compose variations on his theme, subtle adjustments dictated by Volkov's cold data. He began drinking heavily, the tremor in his hands worsening until he could barely hold a pen. He listened to the broadcast every night, a torturous act of self-flagellation. He could hear the weapon he had created sinking its teeth into the soul of his city. One night, in a desperate act of rebellion, he wove a single, jarringly dissonant chord into the score, a micro-dissonance, a cry for help that only a trained ear might catch. He waited for the broadcast, praying someone would notice the flaw in the perfection. The song played, the chord came and went, the city slept. The next morning, Volkov entered his quarters, his face as calm and pale as ever. "A fascinating harmonic choice, Anton," he said, his voice a silken threat. An expression of internal conflict. Perhaps it was an interesting variable. We have logged the population's lack of response. He paused, placing a hand on Levin's shoulder. The touch was like ice. "My instruments are more sensitive than the human ear. They detect any deviation. Please do not deviate again. Your daughter, she has such a lovely voice. It would be a shame for her to catch a permanent cold." Levin understood. He was no longer a composer. He was a technician, tuning an instrument of mass submission. But someone else was listening. Someone else saw the pattern. Dr. Anya Petrova, a physician at a crowded public clinic, began to notice a new, unnamed sickness. Patients came to her with physical ailments, but they described their own pain with a strange, detached curiosity, as if reporting on a stranger's body. They showed no fear, no anger, no grief. She saw a creeping emotional paralysis, a lethargy of the soul. In her secret journal, she called it acoustic apathy. She started to track it, and she discovered a terrifying correlation. The most severe cases, the most complete emotional voids, were in the neighborhoods closest to the state-run listening kiosks, public squares where Volkov's team broadcast the Nightingale's song on high-quality speakers, for those without audios. Dr. Volkov, meanwhile, was not satisfied with mere pacification. He was refining his weapon. He began introducing new, subtle frequencies into the carrier wave, each designed for a specific purpose. One frequency seemed to inhibit critical thought, making the populace more receptive to official news bulletins. Another, a slightly higher pulse, appeared to amplify feelings of communal loyalty while suppressing individual desire. He was no longer just calming the city, he was conducting it. He was sculpting a new kind of citizen, obedient, productive, and blissfully unaware of the beautiful song that was devouring their minds. Following Levin's failed act of sabotage, Project Nightingale entered a new, more sinister phase. Dr. Volkov, recognizing the limits of a citywide broadcast subject to atmospheric interference and listener distraction, ordered the construction of a new facility. Deep in the sublevels of the bunker, beyond reinforced steel doors, his engineers built what they called the harmonic chamber. It was an anechoic room, a place of absolute terrifying silence, the walls lined with black foam wedges that consumed all sound. This was not a broadcast studio. It was a sterile, acoustic operating theater where the signal could be administered in its purest, most potent form. The subjects for the chamber were no longer the general populace. They were political dissidents, captured enemy agents, and intellectuals whose thoughts were deemed unharmonious to the state. These were the research volunteers, brought to the chamber to test the full, devastating potential of the Nightingale's song. The results were unlike the creeping apathy seen in the city. They were immediate and absolute. A captured foreign spy, a man who had resisted weeks of brutal physical torture without breaking, was placed in the chamber. For 3 hours, he was exposed to a targeted broadcast, Levin's melody interwoven with a high-intensity, concentrated version of Volkov's carrier wave. When the door was opened, the man was no longer a man. He sat calmly on the floor, his eyes vacant. He responded to commands with the instant, unquestioning obedience of a dog. He could recite complex technical data from his past missions, but when asked his own name, or his mother's name, he simply stared blankly. His identity, his loyalties, his very self had been neatly and surgically excised, leaving behind a programmable human machine. Anton Levin was forced to watch these experiments through an observation window, a special torment devised by Volkov. He was made to see the ultimate application of his art. His music, once a source of beauty and connection, was now the scalpel used to lobotomize souls. His decline accelerated. He stopped eating. He spoke to no one. His journal, once filled with musical notation, now contained only 2 things, repeated over and over like a broken prayer: the name of his daughter and frantic, scrawled drawings of a single, silent bird with a broken neck. This was his new symphony, a silent testament to the murder of his art. Dr. Anya Petrova's investigation had become a dangerous obsession. The pattern was undeniable. Her acoustic apathy patients all lived within a 5-block radius of the Grand National Radio Tower or one of the public listening kiosks. But now she was hearing new, more disturbing whispers, rumors of dissidents who had been taken for re-education and returned. Wrong. They were physically unharmed, but their families spoke of them as empty shells, strangers wearing familiar faces. Petrova knew she was treading on fatal ground, but she could not stop. She used her position as a physician to gain access to the military wing of the hospital, under the pretense of requisitioning medical supplies. There, in a sealed records room, she found it. A file marked Aegis Initiative, Subject Dispositions. It was not a medical file. It was Volkov's research log. The science laid bare on the pages was a work of diabolical genius. Volkov had mapped the human brain's electrical frequencies with breathtaking precision. He had cataloged the specific wave patterns for loyalty, fear, love, creativity, and rebellion. His work was not about suppression, it was about replacement. The Nightingale's song was a Trojan horse. The carrier wave would first quiet the brain's natural noise, creating a state of placid receptivity. Then a second layer of subharmonic frequencies, too low to be consciously heard, would imprint new instructions. It could overwrite memory. It could erase learned behaviors. It could sever the connection between emotion and thought. It was a technology of total psychic dominion. He wasn't just creating quiet citizens. He was building a new species of human, one whose very consciousness could be edited and controlled by the state. At the bottom of the file was a proposal for Phase 2. The citywide broadcast had been a success. The chamber experiments had proven the weapon's ultimate potential. Now Volkov wanted to install his acoustic emitters in every factory, every school, every apartment block. He wanted to create a permanent, invisible cage of sound, ensuring that every citizen from birth to death would be perfectly and perpetually in tune with the will of the state. He was on the verge of achieving a level of totalitarian control that tyrants of the past could only have dreamed of. Petrova realized the entire city was scheduled to be moved from the operating table into a permanent, acoustically sealed asylum. A single, devastating pulse. But they needed a distraction. Petrova's role was to create chaos within the bunker. Her target was Anton Levin. She found him in his quarters, a ghost haunted by his own music. She didn't offer him hope. She offered him a chance at a meaningful end. "They are going to do this to the whole country, Anton," she whispered, showing him the file. "Your daughter will grow up in a world where music is a cage. You can help me stop it. You can write one last song." For the first time in months, a flicker of light returned to the composer's eyes. Not hope, but purpose. The final act came on the eve of the city's largest patriotic festival. As the city waited for the nightly broadcast, a different signal began. It wasn't Kadia's pure voice. It was a raw, unfiltered recording of the partisans in the holding block, screaming in terror and confusion as they were subjected to the song, followed by the chillingly calm, empty voice of the spy reciting his own obituary. Petrova, using a secondary audio line Mikhail had unlocked for her, was broadcasting the truth. In the bunker, chaos erupted. Alarms blared, guards scrambled. Volkov, his composure finally shattered, screamed orders to cut the feed, but it was too late. While every technician was focused on the rogue broadcast, Anton Levin walked calmly into the main studio. He sat at the grand piano, and as the guards burst in, he began to play. It was not a lullaby. It was a single, monstrous chord, a cluster of notes so dissonant, so filled with pain and rage, that it felt like the sound of a soul being torn apart. He hammered the keys again and again, his final composition a scream of pure, glorious defiance. This was Mikhail's signal. As every system was focused on Levin's sonic assault, Mikhail threw the main breaker switch on the purge frequency. For 1 second, an absolute, unearthly silence fell over the city as every speaker, every radio went dead. Then came the pulse. It was a sound that no one heard, but everyone felt. A wave of pure, silent force erupted from the Grand National Tower. Glass in windows miles away shattered. Birds fell from the sky. In the bunker, every vacuum tube in Volkov's elaborate machinery exploded in a shower of sparks. The magnetic tapes holding his research were instantly wiped clean. The work of his life, the architecture of his weapon, was annihilated in a single, silent blast. In that moment of silent thunder, the nightingale's song was erased forever. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a wound. In the city, a million minds, suddenly severed from the invisible strings that had guided them, convulsed. It was not a gentle awakening. It was a violent psychic expulsion. For months, their emotions had been muted, their memories curated, their griefs anesthetized by a beautiful lie. Now everything came flooding back at once. The city drowned in a tidal wave of returned grief. A cacophony of weeping replaced the serene hum. Memories, raw and unedited, returned like shrapnel to the brain. The calm, productive shells cracked open, and the raw, terrified, heartbroken people inside were exposed to the full horror of their reality. They did not know why. They only knew that for a moment, the world had gone silent, and then the pain had returned 100-fold. In the bunker, the aftermath was swift and surgical. Anton Levin was found slumped over his piano, his hands still resting on the keys of his final, terrible chord. It was his only honest composition, and it had cost him his life. The official report would state he suffered a heart attack, a patriot overwhelmed by the passion of his work. Dr. Anya Petrova and the engineer Mikhail were never seen again. They became ghosts, their names erased from employment records, their apartments emptied, their existence officially denied. They were not heroes of the resistance. They were loose ends, and the state was ruthlessly efficient at tying them. Dr. Volkov was found in the wreckage of his harmonic chamber, surrounded by the shattered glass of his instruments. He was alive, but his mind, the most complex instrument of all, was broken. Some say the silent pulse had wiped his own brain clean. Others believe that after years spent immersed in his controlling frequency, the sudden, absolute silence was a shock his psyche could not withstand. He was transferred to a remote institution for the politically insane Lees. Ted as a casualty of a tragic laboratory accident. The architect of psychic control spent the rest of his life in a padded room, staring at a wall, a man erased by the echo of his own weapon. The truth was given a state funeral and buried in an unmarked grave. Within hours, a new narrative was broadcast. The enemy, in a desperate act of terror, had unleashed a new sonic weapon, a nerve pulse designed to cause mass confusion and panic. The momentary silence, the shattered windows, the city's collective breakdown, it was all blamed on them. The state positioned itself not as the perpetrator, but as the protector that had weathered the attack. The lie was elegant, airtight, and believed by everyone, because the alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. The Grand National Radio Tower, now a symbol of the enemy's attack, was torn down a month later in a solemn public ceremony, erasing the weapon's true source. The bunker was sealed, its secrets entombed in concrete. The official files on Project Nightingale were burned, save for a single copy locked in the deepest vault of the state security archives. Katia, the little girl with the voice of an angel, was quietly removed from the state orphanage and vanished, her voice silenced forever. But the city never truly recovered. The people were free from the song, but they were now haunted by its absence. A phantom melody lingered in the collective subconscious. An entire generation developed a strange aversion to certain lullabies, a deep distrust of public speakers, a fear of absolute silence. They were scarred by a war they never knew was fought, casualties of a weapon they never knew existed. Dr. Petrova's journal, smuggled out of the city by a sympathetic morgue attendant, remains the only testament. A single, scorched notebook against the official, fabricated history of an entire nation. It tells the story of how a government, in its quest for perfect control, almost succeeded in tuning the humanity out of its people, and how the only thing that stopped them was the terrible, beautiful sound of a single breaking soul. Project Nightingale was more than a weapon. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that the human soul itself can be tuned, edited, and silenced with an elegant, irresistible melody. It proved that the most effective cage is not one of steel, but one of sound, one that the prisoners help build and beg to be locked inside. The true horror of the Nightingale's song is not that it controlled people. It is that it worked so beautifully. The state did not need whips or chains. It had a lullaby. It offered peace in exchange for self, and the people broken by war and fear made the trade willingly. And the awakening, the violent return of truth that Petrova and Mikhail unleashed, was its own kind of trauma. It teaches us the most terrifying lesson of all, that sometimes the truth does not set you free. It simply returns you to your pain. Do not think this is a ghost story from a forgotten war. The technology has simply evolved. The radio tower has been replaced by the servers that hum silently beneath our cities. The carrier wave is no longer just a sound. It is the invisible stream of data that curates your reality, the algorithm that learns your desires and fears, and gently, imperceptibly, tunes your worldview. The melody is no longer a child's song. It is the endless scroll, the customized feed, the comforting echo chamber that makes you feel seen, understood, and compliant. Now it is time to make a choice. Are you a passive receiver, or have you learned to listen for the frequency beneath the noise? The first step is to declare your awareness. In the comments below, I want you to make your declaration. Write the words twice to affirm your new state of being. I am listening. I am listening. By doing this, you are signaling to yourself and to the world that you are no longer just consuming, you are decoding. If you are ready to continue this work, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you do not miss the next transmission. Share this with one other person who you believe is capable of hearing the real message. The powers that be built their empires on the noise of distraction. They believe you are too overwhelmed to notice the subtle programming. They are wrong. The most important truths are transmitted in the silence between the words, and we are teaching you how to hear them.